Welcome to this module on structuring your deals and calculating the costs that are associated to those potential opportunities that you come across and making sure that the costs work for structuring the deal. So what are we going to cover in this module? We're going to look at how you go about structuring your deal. So once you've had your conversations with the seller and you're looking at opportunities, maybe through agents, once you're starting to find opportunities, how do you go about working out whether it makes sense for you to do the deal or not? We're going to look at the sort of costs that you need to consider. What are the other things apart from just the standard kind of mortgage product and insurance? What sort of other things should you be considering? And we're also going to look at how you can calculate your refurbishment costs and how you work out what sort of costs they're going to be. So those are the key elements that we're going to cover in this module. So let's look at the first thing that we need to consider. So what we need to look at is, before we look at offering a solution to someone, whether that's through an agent or directly with a seller, we need to make sure that we've clearly understood what the problem is, particularly if you're dealing with motivated sellers. There's no point in guessing at what the solution might be because that solution may not match up with their problem. So whatever the problem is, we need to find a solution that matches that, and we need to find that through working through the different costs that we're going to incur, looking at the facts and figures, what all the numbers are that we've identified in our research, as well as the elements of what's actually going to come together around any potential costs that we may need to incur, either during the process of getting it ready for letting, or if we're going to resell, whatever we're going to do with the property, we need to look at not only the research as to whether we're getting a good deal on the purchase as it is and its market value, but also in relation to what we're going to spend on it. So let's just have a little look through at what the initial things that we may need to consider. So you've got the initial capital cost, and that capital cost may be a deposit with a mortgage in addition to that. So you may be leveraging your money and getting finance to help you fund the deal. So what is the capital cost going to be for you? You need to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of how you're going to fund the opportunity. And obviously the different finance options that are out there, there's lots of different ways that you can finance your property. You could go for your standard buy-to-let mortgage product if you're doing a buy-to-let property, and that can have varying different criteria around its loan to value element. So sometimes it might be 80% loan to value or maybe 75% loan to value. So if your property is going to cost you £100,000, then you may need to put in £25,000 as a deposit, depending on the criteria of the bank. It will also depend on the rental income, so there's usually a rental multiplier that the bank will also work out, and it's whichever is most in favour usually of the bank rather than most in favour of you. They will want you to put more deposit in if the rent isn't sufficient enough, depend on their rental calculator. If it's a commercial mortgage, then that can have a different impact. If it's something that you're doing that's maybe, let's say, a house of multiple occupation and you can't get a standard buy-to-let product on it, then you may need to go down a commercial route, or perhaps you're looking at something like a flat over a shop, and again, you're not able to get the standard buy-to-let product. That's not to say that you can't, but in some occasions, you are not able to use the standard buy-to-let products in there, and you may need to consider commercial funding. And therefore you need to understand the requirements for capital cost in commercial, as well as your outlay ongoing and what that's actually going to cost you on an ongoing basis. Because they are slightly different in terms of the products. You may go for something like bridging, if you're bridging finance, if you were considering buying and maybe selling the property fairly quickly. You might not want to tie yourself into any particularly long mortgage product, and therefore you just want to get in and get out as quickly as possible, and you want to get your hands on the cash fairly quickly. Then that could mean that you're looking at something like a bridging facility to enable you to get the money quickly, buy the property and then either refinance or sell it on to someone else once you've done maybe some work and added some value to it. Um, so there's all sorts of different things that you need to consider when you're looking at what sort of capital costs you're going to require for the property. Because in addition to the actual purchase of it, you may also require some finance to fund a refurbishment or some work that needs doing to the property in order for you to be able to add the value if you're going to do that, or if it's in a condition that needs some updating before you can perhaps tenant it. So you need to consider what all your capital costs are so that you know that you've got enough to purchase the property. So when you're looking at the opportunity that is presented to you through a seller, you've got to consider not just what they want, but also what you can possibly achieve in order to make it a solution for both of you. You've got your purchase costs, you'll have legal costs, you might have some agent fees. Now, normally the seller would have an agent fee, but you may have offered to pay that if they haven't got the money, or perhaps you've used somebody who's sourced your property, and therefore you might have a fee to pay a sourcer. And so you need to consider the other fees that you might incur, survey fees, you might have a mortgage broker fee, those types of things. And you might want to factor all of those in and put them all together so that you'll understand what your outlay is at the very beginning. So that even before you get into negotiating with a vendor, you've understood a rough idea of what the investment is going to be for you. So let's have a look at the ongoing costs and the impact of those. So what sort of ongoing costs might impact your profit, if you like, so that you understand the solution that you can offer to the vendor? Well, obviously you're going to have your finance costs. So if you haven't got all of the cash to put down, then you are going to have to borrow some money, and you're going to have to make sure that that finance cost is covered. And to be fair, even if you have got the money to put in, the likelihood is that that money's been making you money somewhere else. So you want to at least make sure that you're going to make that and more, presumably. Otherwise, you may not be considering investing. So you've got some finance costs that you're going to have to cover. You've got the normal kind of insurance costs. So I would highly recommend that you get the right insurance for your needs, and that can vary in cost depending on what your needs are, and whether you want just a very standard insurance product. And I would say that cheapest isn't always the best. You may need to look and shop around and maybe talk to a property insurance specialist so that you get the right cover for you. You might want different things like rent guarantee or accidental cover on your property. So depends on what sort of risk you profile you might have. You might need to get a more robust insurance product than someone else might have. So I'd encourage you to go and speak to a few insurance brokers and get some idea of what sort of cost it's going to be for you. And if you haven't got a specific property in mind at this stage, then that's okay, because you can just talk to them about maybe a standard 3-bedroom property, if that's the sort of thing that you're going to be looking for, a 2 or a 3-bedroom property, just a very standard one. What sort of insurance might you need for that, and how much is that going to cost you? Because that will impact your cash flow on a monthly basis. The other thing to consider is management fees, so letting agents or property management fees. Are you going to find your own tenants, or are you going to have somebody else help you find them? Are you going to be someone who manages your own properties, or are you going to have a letting or management agent to help you do that? Now, regardless of whether you have someone to help you do that or not, there will be some fees. It may not be management fees, but it could be that you've got some advertising fees in order to find your tenant. You might not have those fees ongoing, but they might be costs that you need to consider at the outset when you're finding tenants. And you will constantly have a need for tenants. It might not, if it's a single let property, you might not have an ongoing need for that. It might be very random every couple of years or every year. If it's a house of multiple occupation, you might find that you need a little bit more to find your tenants because you've got more rooms to fill, and your tenants may not stay quite as long as they would in perhaps a single let property, and so therefore you might need to put in some a slightly bigger budget for a house of multiple occupation to that you would put in for a single let property. So whatever you're planning to do, whether you're planning to find your own tenants and manage it yourself, or whether you're planning to use an agent, consider what your ongoing costs will be regarding managing your property and finding your tenants. Then you can look at things like boiler cover and whether you want something that will insure your your boiler, and maybe even some other things around your house. There are various companies that offer different types of cover and different types of maintenance packages that will give you peace of mind if you're somebody that's new to this and you're not sure, you're quite happy to manage it yourself maybe, but you want that reassurance around having a team on hand to help you with making sure that your property is maintained. There are all sorts of things that companies offer, from standard boiler cover right through to covering the whole system of plumbing and gas and electric and drainage, all sorts of different things that you can get cover for. And if you've just got one or two properties and you don't want to go about finding your own team of people to do it, it might be a more cost effective way and a more efficient way for you to have a product that gives you good coverage for annual servicing, annual maintenance, and looking after the property, so that you've just a phone call away from getting someone to help you. And so consider that in terms of your ongoing costs. For majority of people, they'll be looking to either use the referrals through your management company, or you'll build up the contacts locally and you'll get cost-effective pricing, as well as the ability to have a good enough relationship with someone where if you need them, you can call them out and they'll be there. And I'd really encourage you to identify some people that you can work with, even if you do have one or two properties, or if you've got 10 or 15 properties. It's really important that you build that relationship, because it's usually at a time when everybody else has got the same thing breaking down that you need them to be there. So if you think about in the winter time, your boiler tends to be more likely to break down because it's used more, and therefore the plumbers and gas engineers are in much more demand at that time of year. And if you've got a very good relationship with your plumber or gas engineer, you'll find it a lot easier to get them out, and also they won't charge you that extra price for coming out at short notice. Whereas if you don't have a relationship with them, then you may be paying call out fees and charges. If something goes wrong over maybe say the festive period, then you may have to pay additional call out charges, which can be extra money. So just think about those things. You maybe just make a small allowance for them until you've built up relationships, so that you can make sure that you've got an established relationship with someone to keep your costs down. Now we're looking at a little bit more detail about maintenance and how you cover that as we progress through this, just to look at the detail about what sort of cover you might want to put in there. Because the other thing that you need to consider is voids. So voids being where your property isn't tenanted. So if you are doing property where you're letting it out and you're keeping a hold of property and you've got tenants in it, then you will have occasions where your property does have maybe a week or two, or maybe in some cases it might be a month or two, where you aren't able to tenant the property. And that could be for a number of reasons. It might be that you have to have it empty to do work to it. It could be because you're just not able to find a tenant. So it's important to have some allowance for some voids, just to make sure, even if you've got strong tenant demand, there may be the odd occasion where you have to have the property free and it's still costing you money because you're still paying maybe your mortgage. You're still going to be paying your insurance, so there's still some costs even if your property is empty. So therefore it's really important that you put an allowance in for that when you're calculating whether the property opportunity that you're looking at is going to work for you or not. Now, one of the things I would recommend you do is that you put a little spreadsheet together that's going to help you just look at opportunities very quickly, just to see whether they work for you or don't work for you. And I'm just going to share with you just a little example of a spreadsheet that you can consider, some of the elements that might be worth looking at, so that you can try and consider what you might need to put in your spreadsheet. So on the left-hand side here, we have basic details. So you've got your purchase price. In this example, it's 80,000. And in this example, we're doing it as a house of multiple occupation. So we've got quite a high rent. And what we're looking at here is that we've got a deposit required of £20,000. Now, the way that I've set up my spreadsheets, I like to have things that are pre-populated, so I have calculations in. So the boxes in green are basically the ones that I go in and change, and the boxes in white are the ones that will automatically change based on information that's being pulled from somewhere else. So that deposit figure is calculated based on, if you move along a couple of columns, there's some mortgage details, and you'll see that there's a loan to value figure there. And the loan to value in this case, in this example, is 75% loan to value. So basically you're looking at borrowing 75% of the purchase price, which means that you'll be able to borrow 60,000 potentially from a bank or building society or lender, and you need to put in a deposit of 20,000. Okay, so looking at the basic details again, the column on the left, we've got in this example where the expected market rent is £1,630. Now that's because we're looking to do this as a room share. So this is a particularly good rental income, and these are the kind of figures that you can achieve, and sometimes more than that. But this is the sort of figure that you might be able to achieve if you did a room share property where you're renting out individual rooms rather than renting out the whole house. They can take a little bit more work, but equally that's got better income as a result of that. So it's if you've got 5 rooms to rent, then it's no different to having 5 houses to rent. You're going to have a little bit more work than if you had 1 house. So if we then move on to the second column, which is the purchase information, so we've got stamp duty. In this case, it's below the stamp duty threshold. We don't need to put a cost in there. It's 0%. We might need to get a survey done if we're getting a mortgage. So you might have a survey cost of, let's say, an estimated cost of around £350, and some solicitor costs for your purchase, maybe around £700, somewhere in that region. And it does very much depend on the cost of your property, will depend on how much your legal fees can be. Some solicitors will charge you more for higher value properties. Some solicitors have a fairly standard cost. So you just need to do a little bit of research, contact some solicitors and find out what sort of cost are you going to be for purchasing your property. In this place, you can also factor in maybe if there's a sources fee or a finder's fee for someone who's brought the opportunity to you. If you're finding your own, then there's no cost of that. You may need to consider some bridging if you're also borrowing some money on bridging, maybe for a refurbishment or to help you towards some of the funding and the lending. And so therefore, there's opportunity for you to calculate that within your initial cost. We then move over to the mortgage details and the ongoing costs and look at what some of the costs might be there. So if you've got a 75% loan to value, then you've obviously got a deposit, which you can work out how much that deposit's costing you. In this example, what I'm doing is I'm using a figure that's more likely to be the sort of rate that you pay on a commercial lending, where or something where you're not paying interest only, you're paying interest and repayment. So that's going to be somewhere maybe in 7% or more. Now, the interest won't be 7%, but the overall percentage of the monthly payment will be at least 7%. And that's because part of it's capital and part of it's interest. The next thing is we're looking at rental cover. Now, I said earlier about the fact that when you do a buy-to-let product, very often there's 2 criteria. There's the loan to value, and there's also what's called rental cover. So what I've done here is we've put in rental cover. The bank want to make sure that the rent more than covers, or at least covers, in this case it's 125%, so they want it to more than cover what you're actually borrowing, and so that the monthly rental income, there's at least 25% more of the monthly rental income than there is amount of mortgage payment that you're paying on a monthly basis. And that's where that 1.25 figure comes in, so that you can calculate what you'd actually need. In this case, because we're multi-letting it, we're not actually going to come anywhere close to that. We're going to have plenty rental income. But if that was a single let property, you can see that the rent needed, if you do that calculation at 125% of the rent that we need is £437.50. So if you were buying that property and you were thinking about just letting it to a family, if it was only going to rent at £425 a month, then the bank would be looking for you to put in more than 75% loan to value. You'd have to redo the figures, and it's likely that they would only lend you something like 70% loan to value rather than 75, because the rent doesn't quite cover the actual mortgage payment, or more 25% more than the mortgage payment. So look out for those two figures, loan to value and rental cover, when you're looking at buy-to-let products. The next thing that you need to consider in terms of costs is that when you take a lending product, usually there is some fees attached to that. Now, very often you can add the fees to the lending product and you can pay those off over time, but sometimes you might not be able to. So there's maybe things like bridging finance where you might need to pay the fees separately. If you are usually using a standard mortgage product, there is an opportunity for you to add that setup fee to the mortgage normally. And that can vary. It varies depending on the product. So speak to your mortgage broker. I've put in this example 1.5% of the overall borrowing. So that works out around about £900 in this case, because we're borrowing £60,000. So those are the costs that you need to consider when you are doing the purchase. Now, looking at the ongoing costs, if you just take out a standard insurance for this sort of property, you might be looking at something like £150 a year, £12.50 a month. Again, I'd encourage you to get very specific to what you need. Now, you might be somebody who's quite experienced, you're happy, you've got a team around you, and therefore you don't need any boiler insurance or boiler cover, and you've decided that you're not going to use a letting agent. And so there's no fees in there for letting agency. You've got your mortgage amount that you're paying each month. That's obviously something you need to consider in the ongoing costs. And then you've got a loan repayment. That's basically where, if you borrowed some extra money to maybe finance the part of the borrowing for maybe refurbishment, then you might be paying that back across the months, and it's separate to the mortgage. You may not be able to get the two together, or you might be able to then subsequently refinance to add it to the mortgage. So if there's any loan repayment, don't forget to add that in there. You'd also need to consider in a house of multiple occupation, and this part is more specific to house of multiple occupation, because if it was a single let, you wouldn't need to necessarily consider utilities and other costs. So in here we've got some costs for gas, electric and water of around £250 a month, maybe a cleaner or a gardener. Depending on the time of year, you might not have a gardener all year round, but you might want somebody to look after it in the summer. So roughly about approximately £40 a month for that. And then broadband, that can vary. So put in £20 or £30 a month for your broadband. Most people want to have that sort of facility as a standard offering within a property, particularly if it's a furnished room share property. They want to have broadband as standard. Some of them you might need to be competitive. You might need to look at other products, like what offerings you can do around Sky or television, that type of thing, and just look at what your competition is doing, so that you understand what sort of costs you're going to incur. If you're also letting it on a room share basis, you'll have to consider the council tax, because you could be responsible for that, unless you may be letting it to students who can, get that council tax rebate, and therefore they become responsible for that. So it depends on exactly how you're letting it. It will depend on the exact ongoing costs, but we factored in here £80 a month for council tax. With a TV licence, again, if it was a single let, you wouldn't need to consider, but with multi-let, if you're going to put a television in, which in most cases you might put one in the communal space, then you'll need to make sure that it has a television licence. And so you need to factor that cost in. You can either pay it up front, or you could pay it monthly, just to make sure it never runs out. Then you've got it on a monthly basis. That's something that I like to do, is to make sure that whatever I've got is not going to run out because I've forgotten or got busy doing something else, and I've forgotten to get the TV licence, or I've forgotten to reinsure it, or just completely forgotten to pay a bill, and suddenly discover that I've got this big bill because I've forgot to pay the previous one. So really good to put, well, in my experience, good to put things on regular payments. It manages your costs throughout the year and also means that you don't forget to pay anything at any point in time. So with that, those you can add up to your total ongoing costs, and you can look at how that compares with the expected market rent. And that allows you then to see what sort of profit you will be able to make on that sort of property. Now, if you're looking to go and meet with a vendor, so let's say that you've spoken to a seller of a property and you're seriously considering what they've got to offer, you might be in the process of thinking about going to view the property. What I would really encourage you to do is before you go and view, do some of your research and just put some tentative figures into your spreadsheet so that you can get some thoughts and some idea of what your initial cost is going to be and what your ongoing costs are going to be, so that you can start to look at what you might be able to offer if you wanted to put an offer forward when you actually go and see the property and meet with the seller or meet with the agent. If you don't do this beforehand, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to do it on the spot, and you're going to have to come away and consider it. Now, you might still want to come away and consider it, but it will give you a much better idea of whether it's going to be possible for you to structure a deal and make something work both for you and the seller if you've got some idea and you've done some research around what the values of the property are and what the costs are going to be prior to actually going to view the property. Now, if you're going to lease it, you're not actually going to buy it, you can use this spreadsheet. If you're going to do a rent to rent or you're going to do a lease option, you can still use the spreadsheet. You may not actually be needing to get the purchase price right now, but if you're doing an option to buy and at some point you're going to have to buy it, then you can still punch in the idea of what sort of purchase price you think might work in the future or what you would be prepared to pay for it now. And then what you can do is you can play around with the rate cover and the mortgage details so that you can see how much you can afford to pay on a monthly basis. So let's say, for example, on this one, that you wanted to make on average about £700 a month profit. Then what you've got here is that you've got a profit figure of 697 at a rate of 7%, and that's costing you on a monthly basis for your mortgage £355. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about here is that we've factored in maintenance and voids. So we'll come back to that in a minute because that does impact on the cash flow amount that's on the right hand side, indicating that you're nearly at £700. But what you can do is you can play around with how much you'll pay on a monthly basis. So if I was looking at trying to make £700, that's telling me that the most I can really pay, if I was going to use this model and I was going to multi-let this property and my expected market rent was 1,630, then the most I can really afford to pay is £355 a month based on that 7% cover. That's given me a monthly payment of £355 because I want to achieve my £700 a month profit. Now you might say, well, actually, Susan, you know what, you factored in maintenance and voids each month. Well, I'm not expecting it to be that high. So what I've done there is that I factor in 5% for maintenance and 5% for voids. So that's 5% of the rental income. Now, your maintenance might not be as high as that and your voids might not be as high as that. But the reality is that I don't know any landlords that don't have maintenance on their property. So there's no point in pretending that you're not going to have any maintenance. So whatever figure you use, I just recommend that you put something in there. If I'm looking at a property that's maybe a bit older, that is a bit more dated, needs a bit more work, I might actually figure in more than 5%. I might put it up towards 10% because I know that over time, because it's dated, it's needing some work, that I'm going to have to do that work to it. If I've just factored in the capital costs to refurbish it all, then my maintenance is likely going to be quite low. I personally don't go below 5%. I try and always factor in at least 5%. And if I don't use it, that's great. But at least I've worked it out so that I'm not overpaying for the property because I know I will have maintenance. Now, again, you can do the same with voids. So if you are not sure about whether you will be able to fill the property quickly or whether you'll be able to keep it full, you might want to factor in slightly higher voids, because you can always reduce it when you find out the reality of it. But you might want to factor in at least 5% for voids. If it's in a very popular area, you may not require to use 5%, but if it's not, and you're really not sure and you've not worked that area before, then you might see that you want to increase that to maybe 10% of the rental income until you become more familiar with the area. And I put that information in there, and when you add that on this property, I've put aside 10%, so that's £160 a month. Now, some people don't account for that, and therefore their profit would be showing not £700 but £830. Sorry, 860, because that's £160. So it would be shown at £860. Now, you and I both know that that might be possible, but the likelihood is you're going to have to spend some money on maintenance. So your true profit is not going to be £830 each month. Therefore, you are better to factor that in before you negotiate the deal with the seller. If you account for it, you at least know what your limitations are, and you can work out a deal that's going to make sure that you always make profit, and you always make the sort of profit that you want to make. Now, you might need to play around with it just to make the figures work a little bit. You might need to reduce your profit a little bit if it's, if you can only make £600 a month and you had to pay the seller £450. You might accept that because you've got a little bit of an extra allowance in there for maintenance void. You know that it's been well maintained. You know that it's going to rent really quickly. So you're not going to need quite as much for maintenance and voids. So by using the spreadsheet and putting something together, you'll be able to very quickly do your research on a property, put some numbers into your spreadsheet and work out what your profit's going to be, as well as what your initial costs are going to be. And that will really help you when you're going to negotiate your opportunities. Now, clearly, when you are looking at opportunities, you will find that there are some costs that you're just not really sure about. And therefore, you need to think about what are some of your options. So you need to consider some of the factors that you are unaware of. And that's why you can't consider the actual solution completely until you've understood all of the facts. So make sure that once you've seen the property and you've gone back and you've asked questions, that you don't just put an offer forward until you're absolutely certain that you've understood that your solution and the numbers that you've used are going to make that offer work. So if you need to go back and refine it after you've been to see the property, after you've maybe considered some of the additional costs, then you need to consider that and put it together and make sure that the numbers work for you. You don't want to end up with a property where you think it works, but you're not absolutely certain. So if there are other factors that you need to consider, you've been to see the property and you've calculated it all, but there's maybe some other bits that you need to put together, like maybe there's some refurbishment work and you're not quite sure of what the costs are going to be, and therefore you need to go away and start to get much more detail on those refurbishment figures. If you're not sure how to calculate that, I would recommend that you consider putting together some quotes. So if you're able to get access to the property to get 2 or 3 quotes on the work, that's great. If you're not able to get access, then one of the things that you might want to consider is, can you make a list of the type of work that needs doing and put as much detail into it as possible, in order for you to speak to some of the relevant tradespeople for you to get some idea of the refurbishment work so that you can calculate that. Because if you've got refurbishment work that needs doing, it can often be hundreds or thousands of pounds out rather than, just a few pounds out. And therefore it's quite important that you get some quotes and some understanding of the type of money that you're going to need to do that refurb work. And then also matching that up, if you're trying to add value and make money from it and either sell it on or release some funds from it by refinancing, if you've underestimated your refurbishment work, then you may not be able to do quite what you thought you were going to do. So put together another spreadsheet. If you like spreadsheets, it's a great way to do it. Either use a just pen and paper to calculate your different costs, or put it into a spreadsheet. But put together your spreadsheet so you can calculate the different costs that are going to help you understand. So you can use the example that I've shared with you with all those costs. You might want to have another set of numbers that calculate the different work that needs doing. And you might also want to consider putting some more detail around, if you're using other people's funds, what are the different options? So have you considered what all those options are, so that when you come to put together the solution, that you've understood that that solution is going to work for you, and that you've really considered those numbers sufficiently enough to make it work for you. So taking all those factors into account, that can be really great, and we all like things to work out just exactly the way that we've planned them to work. However, even with all of that, one of the things that you will want to consider is additional costs and additional things that might go wrong with the property, or things that you need to change. So we'll look at some of the additional costs, and we're also going to look at some of your potential sort of considerations around whether you need a plan B as well as a plan A for your property. So what are some of the extra costs that you might need to consider, particularly if you're doing something like HMOs? So furnishings is obviously a standard for an HMO nowadays. You would normally find that you will need to furnish an HMO. However, there might be different norms in your area, so you need to check out what is the normal factor for your area. Do people supply furniture? In my experience, that is 100% the case. You would need to furnish your HMO, and that can be a cost. So depending on how many rooms will depend on how much that's going to cost you. Now you can put that as a capital outlay in the beginning, and you need to speak to your accountant whether it can be capital or not. Or you might want to create it as an ongoing cost. So you can rent furniture if you want. You can rent bedroom furniture, lounge, dining room furniture. You can rent white goods. So if you wanted to have it in your ongoing cost rather than as an upfront cost, if you haven't got the £2,000 or £3,000 that you might need to furnish the property, you might say, well, I'd rather rent it and pay an extra couple £100 a month for it, because a lot of the rental companies also will refresh your furniture so you can get it updated every few years. Now, obviously, the more often you want it updated, the more it will cost you, but there are all sorts of different packages that you can consider. So that's obviously particular to HMOs, and also can be particular to areas where maybe furnished flats or furnished accommodation is quite popular, even on a family or a single-let property. And places like London, very often you can get a lot of furnished accommodation. People come and go, much more transient, and therefore they don't like to be moving their furniture. They want to go in and live in a furnished property. So whatever's the norm in your area, check out what sort of costs you're going to incur. I would also check out on an HMO basis your room lets and what sort of other costs are included. So we talked earlier about the kind of costs that you might incur on an HMO, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's standard in every area. So some areas might be that bills are included, some areas might be that bills aren't included. When you have a group of tenants that come together, maybe say as students, it could be that they pay their own bills rather than you paying them. So it's really key for you to understand what the norm is in your area so that you know what your ongoing cost exposure is, and you can work that out before you offer on the property. The other thing to consider, certainly with HMOs, and this goes whether you are licensing them or not, you need to consider the safety of your tenants. And it applies to single lets too, but more predominantly you will find that it applies on a house of multiple occupation and more commercial properties and things like that. So the additional costs would be in relation to fire safety equipment. So you might need to get fire doors and the door closers and the fire safety that comes with the door frames. So there's lots of hidden cost in some of that potentially that you need to consider. So you may not just be able to rent it out as it is, and you may need to put in some extra fire safety security measures there. You might need to put in fire safety alarms, safety detection, so hardwire it in. Sometimes they'll accept battery operated if it's a high standard one. Very often you need to have an electrician come in to fit that safety detection into different rooms so that the smoke detection can be picked up if a fire happens. You may need to put signage up. You may need to supply extinguishers. And therefore those are all little costs, and they're not individually massive costs themselves. But once you add them all up on a whole property, if you have to put, 7 or 8 new doors on with door handles, door frames, put in hardwire smoke detection, an alarm system, if you have to put in extinguishers and safety signs and exits, those little things can start to add up to a few £1,000s. And if you haven't accounted for that money, then you can run out of money fairly quickly. So those are some of the extra costs if you're looking at something particularly like HMOs or furnished properties, or something that's a little bit different to your standard buy-to-let property where you might rent it to maybe just a family and you maybe don't need to consider all of those additional costs. But when you put an offer forward to a seller and taking all those things into consideration, it seems like you've got to do an awful lot of work before you start. Once you've done this once, you won't have to do all of that work again because you'll have some idea of what those costs are, and you'll be able to put them into your spreadsheet if you put a spreadsheet together, and you'll have them fully understood. So you'll be able to factor those in automatically ongoing, and therefore you'll be able to work out what's the best way for you to structure the deal for the seller and also for yourself based on the costs of the property. Now, I would encourage you to think about 2 options. I would only present one, certainly at the outset, but I would ask you to consider what is your exit strategy? What's your plan B? If plan A doesn't work, what's your plan B? And the reason that I suggest that is because the market does change, and therefore if you've gone and bought a property and you've decided to turn it into a house of multiple occupation and something happens to that area, let's say that you decided that you were going to buy a property and make it into a student-let property, and during the process of you purchasing, something happens, maybe Article 4 comes into your area and you're not able to get the relevant planning, or maybe the HMO licensing officer doesn't allow you to have as many rooms as you thought and it doesn't quite work as well as you thought. Or perhaps the university announces that they're going to build new student accommodation and it reduces the amount of students that are available in the area and it no longer works. Then you need to consider what would be your plan B. What is your potential exit strategy if plan A doesn't work? So can you consider, refinancing, releasing some of your initial capital cost? Is that something that you need to consider? If you were buying and selling a property and you couldn't get it sold, could you finance it so that you can release some of your capital and you can at least keep buying until it does sell? If you bought it originally to multi-let and you couldn't multi-let it, can you single-let it? Does it still work? Does it make you money? If it doesn't, what else can you do to get your exit strategy? Maybe you can add value to it and sell on if you're not able to multi-let it. If you bought it to single-let and you find that it doesn't rent particularly well in that area because you didn't do your research or you weren't familiar enough with the area, and you discover that it doesn't rent at the price you thought it was going to rent, or it doesn't rent particularly well, it becomes a problem property for you, what are your potential opportunities to get out or to do something different? So think about that when you're looking to offer on a property, think about what is your potential plan B, so that you don't go in just with one plan, you go in with an alternative plan, because that might influence the amount or the way that you offer. So just by way of an example, let's say that you were going to multi-let property and that was your intention, and you were speaking to a seller who was going to sell their property, and you were quite optimistic and you thought, yeah, I can afford to pay X for the property because it's, let's say you're going to pay £100,000 for it, and you think, well, I can afford to do that because I can multi-let it. But if you could only single let it, that will be too much. Then you may want to consider how well you know the area and how well you know that it will multi-let. If this is your first opportunity and you've never multi-let a property in that area before, you may just want to think about that and think, well, do I really want to stretch it? Because if it doesn't work as a multi-let, do I need to consider that what I need to pay for it if I was only going to single let it? If I was only going to find a family and rent it, can I still afford to pay £100,000 for that property? So I really encourage you to think about your plan B. And I encourage you to look at the different options and look at what sort of cost, if you're going to go and add value in order to sell it, what sort of cost is that going to be? And again, I use different spreadsheets to help me to be able to do that. So again, put some basic details in, think about your cost, so your plan B might be to refurbish, add value, and then sell it. So in this case, I won't run through the spreadsheet in detail, but you might have your basic purchase costs, you might have looked at your upfront cost here, you might look at what are some of the interim costs. So if I was going to have to add value because I couldn't multi-let it, and what other costs am I likely to incur? What ongoing costs, what are the bills down, that I'm going to incur whilst it's empty, whilst I'm refurbishing it? And then on the right, you might look at the income potential. So in this case, we're looking at a resale. So what's the worst case, what's the mid case, and what's the best case? So I can really look at 3 different options. I'm not just looking at my optimistic option. I'm looking at, if the worst came to the worst and I had to sell it because I couldn't get it rented, then if I was doing it at the lowest price possible and still making a profit, what's my worst case scenario? What's my realistic scenario? And if I could get as much as possible for it, what's my best case scenario? And using all of that, you can factor in your costs for selling. If you were doing legal fees there, if there was anything that you needed to change on the title, let's say you bought it and you could potentially title split it, maybe a plan would be to change it and convert it into 2 flats if it doesn't work as a multi-let. So you might have some split of titles and legal costs there that you need to consider. You might have some extra funding that you need to do, and you put in the length of the project and how much that's going to cost you in finance, and then what sort of profit you'd make on that, so that you can work out what's your plan A and what's your plan B. And by using different spreadsheets, that will really help you to very quickly plug in the numbers. It saves you having to work it out every time. You can just change some of the numbers. And that's why we highlight different boxes, so that we're not actually trying to do everything from scratch each time. We're only changing the relevant boxes that are highlighted. So I'd really encourage you, if you don't know how to put spreadsheets together, get some help from somebody that does, so that they can help you put together some spreadsheets that will really work for you, that helps you just put in some basic details, and it punches out, what your profit is, how much you're going to make each month, or if you're selling, how much you'll make at the end based on a worst, middle and best case scenario, and what sort of cost it's going to be. What's your ongoing costs going to be versus your rental income or your refurbishment to selling. So really starting to build it up so that you can consider all your costs, and you can use that to help you structure your deal. Because if you just work it out on a basic fag packet exercise, as they say, about a very quick and dirty calculation, there's a good chance that you're going to forget some of the detail that you need to put into your purchase. So by having a spreadsheet there to help remember that detail, it's a really good way for you to just have a template that helps you get the information that you need. And it will make it much easier when you're considering various opportunities in the future. So what are the things that you need to do based on that information to help you move forward? I'd encourage you to look at 2 properties where you can consider all of the costs. You can take those costs and you can consider what the solution might be for a seller. Now, if you haven't got 2 properties from the marketing and lead generation that you're doing, have a look at a couple of properties online. Have a look at a couple of properties through agents. Maybe some that need a little bit of work so that you can go that extra mile to then follow up with some relevant trades to get estimates for works. Contact furnishing companies if you're thinking about furnishing your property and get estimated costs for furnishing, either for buying outright or for renting. Contact some of the trades that will give you that estimated cost around how much it might be to do the fire safety instalments, the doors, the electric hardware, smoke detection system, those kind of things. And using all that information, I'd ask you to put a spreadsheet together or use some kind of template to analyse your cost, whether that's on a spreadsheet or just in a basic document, so that you can really see what the costs are and you can make it really easy for yourself each time. You're not starting from scratch, you're just changing some of the numbers and looking at the detail to very quickly give you the information you need so that you can work out what can be the solution that you can offer to put an offer forward on that property, whether it's through an agent or directly with a seller. If you're dealing directly with a seller, then there are other factors that you can take into consideration in terms of the way that they might want to sell their property. You can maybe be a little bit more creative with how you structure an opportunity to them. So your specific actions really are: select a couple of properties that you can look at the costs and consider the solution, create a spreadsheet or use a template to analyse your costs quickly, and follow up with some relevant trades so that you can get estimates for work. Even if it's just selecting a standard 3-bed house and finding out how much does it cost to carpet one, how much does it cost to decorate a 3-bed property, how much does it cost to fit a boiler and some radiators in a 3-bed property, how much does it cost to rewire one. You know, those different trades would be able to give you a very rough cost estimate. Now, you might be able to negotiate it down if you had a specific property you were looking at, but at least it would give you some idea. If you're starting from not understanding at all, then I would just make some contact and start to find out some of those numbers for your area. If you're looking at multi-lets, I'd really encourage you to start finding out about the furnishings and the fixtures that you're going to have to put in there, because that will also cost you a few £1,000s. Depending on the way that you fund it, it's really important that you understand that cost at the outset. So I hope that's been a really helpful way for you to look at what you need to consider to structure your deals, the costs that you need to consider, and also how you calculate your refurbishment costs by getting information from those relevant trades. I look forward to speaking to you again in another Property Mentor module. Thank you very much indeed.